In today's episode, we're talking international law, the regulation of plastic pollution, and what's going on with the UN Global Plastics Treaty. Plus, a zombie hunt in Busan. Of course! Here's our conversation with Dr. Alexandra Harrington of Lancaster University Law School. She's an environmental law specialist and chair of the IUCN-WCEL Task Force on Plastic Pollution. We'll get to the meanings of all those acronyms very shortly, but I'm not saying that full title more than once. Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow, the podcast from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability and Business here at Lancaster University Management School. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Babington.
Jan, last episode you promised me we didn't have to leave plastics behind entirely.
And we're not going to, because one of the heads up we got from one of our podcasters from the last few weeks is that there's more expertise at the university in plastics than you'd find in the PIPL project. And we're going to go and find out about that additional bit of information.
Yeah, because we had 6 weeks all looking at the Plastic Packaging in People's Lives project, PIPL, and now we're going to expand beyond that for our look at plastics. So we're going to start to look at plastics legislation.
And it's not the first time we've strayed into the legal field, and we've had some really good guests from the Department of Law here, and we're going to add another one to it.
We are, because we've previously had Rafael Sava and Camilo Cornejo Martinez, whose name flows off the tongue when you can eventually get around to saying it properly. Yeah, and now we've got a third guest. Shall I introduce her?
Yes, please.
Yes. Today we're joined by Alex Harrington, who is a lecturer in environmental law in Lancaster Law School, and is also, Jan, now this title is going to need me to take a big breath before I say it.
Gear yourself up.
Chair of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the World Commission on Environmental Law Agreement on Plastic Pollution Task Force.
I think that sounds like a very important job.
I think it sounds like someone just had too many words and threw them all together in one go. Alex, hello, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. And I apologize for the title length. It matches the length of my full name. Anyway,
It's a cracking title, I'll tell you that. Do you have to shorten that title if ever you have to give it to people? Because
yes.
Even in the footer of an email, that's taking up more than half the rest of the email.
No, easily. So usually it's IUCN, which is what most of the environmental world knows us as, and then WCL for World Commission on Environmental Law. And then I've just found other ways to shorten it to Task Force, Plastics Task Force, something of that nature at this point. Covers all sins. Anyway.
And one thing that we really found from the previous podcast is the realisation that there are many different types of lawyers and many branches of law. So you've already given us a bit of a clue with that super title as to what kind of branches it are. But for our listeners, I wonder if you could place your study of law into the context of law more generally.
Of course, because law is very big and often very intimidating, but there are many different pieces. So I know your other guests, your previous guests, quite well, and I know they've talked about different topics. I work in environmental law, specifically in climate change, but now much more in pollution. So at the international level, and also then at the national level, regulating pollution. Plastics is, obviously this is a topic that I'm quite involved in, but also many other forms of pollution. So mercury with the Minamata Convention, various forms of hazardous waste and transportation of hazardous waste with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, the newly created Global Framework on Chemicals, which I was actually involved in the final negotiations of, and a number of other different topics in that area. I also, relatedly or not, depending on how you see it, work on human rights law, armed conflict, and the law of armed conflict, related to particularly Camilo, just transition. So how do we basically take that and apply it across multiple sectors, not only the climate sector?
And I think particularly for our listeners that are interested in sustainability in business, several times we've talked about sort of like the transnational challenge of having corporations that are headquartered in one place and operate everywhere else, and the way that governance has to be stitched together and novel governance solutions have to be arrived at. And I did some work with an international environmental lawyer once because we kind of realised that corporations, if you like, are on a horizontal plane. They are going to be dealing with each other and they've got the same status. The same happens in international law where countries are on equal footing with each other and have to come to some kind of conclusion for coordinated action for global benefit. So there's some really nice conceptual, theoretical crossovers between how we think about transnational corporations and how they operate, but also how states operate in this context as well.
Absolutely. No, definitely. And it is often complex to think about states as actors, and we think about the global power dynamics, and certainly those come into it. But certainly from a legal perspective and international law perspective, every state is theoretically equal on that plane. And at the end of the day, they all have one vote in whatever we're working on. Now, often they form associations, they form groups, they form various types of committees, et cetera, or their own, whatever they want to call the groupings, to have more power, to have more presence, depending on the negotiation or the treaty implementation. But at the end of the day, each one is its own entity. And that's, I think, something that people find difficult if you're not used to the international law world, because we don't necessarily think of states, for example, Guinea-Bissau, as having the same status as, for example, the UK in terms of power dynamic, but they certainly do in terms of voting capacity in any negotiation.
And I can only imagine it's as smooth as that as well, that every nation just agrees with each other all the time on everything.
I mean, my job is so easy, really. It's just so easy. And they all come together and we have a great time and just, enjoy about 5 to 7 days of sightseeing in whatever place we are. And then, one day of seriousness. Oh, yes, clearly.
Do countries try to use maybe influence from other areas to sway people to their votes, which you'd imagine would happen? Some countries might have the greater economic power, and while you say Guinea-Bissau and the UK have the same number of votes, the UK might have more influence and say, you need to vote with us on this and then we'll let you have X, Y, and Z.
Absolutely, definitely. And so the power dynamics do come into play. Although what we've seen interestingly in the plastics negotiation in particular, and we'll get to hopefully the background on this a bit more, but we've seen coalitions forming. Some of them have made life much more challenging in terms of treaty progress than others, but coalitions forming to try to counteract some of that. So coalitions of countries that might be, for example, from Latin America or the African region that typically wouldn't have that much power, now coming together to say we are combined a block of, say, 60 to 70 countries. So we do represent a significant amount of votes, and that's how they're trying to counter that one-on-one power dynamic that is often very much skewed and very much unbalanced.
I guess you see that more publicly in things like the COP that have gone on recently with the low-lying nations, those that are going to be more affected by sea level rise, and you see them coming together, and that's a similar thing to what you're saying with plastics.
Absolutely, and those same nations actually are quite active in the plastics context, because not only are they facing the sea level rises, they're also facing a great deal of challenge from having plastics, particularly in the marine environment, coming onto their shores, washing up when they've not had anything to do with their use or generation, and then having to figure out how to deal with them from a waste management perspective, and also what's actually in them, which is something that I think we all recognize. Most of us have been on a beach at some point in our lives and seen plastic. But what we don't necessarily think about when we see things like beach cleans, et cetera, which are wonderful and global commitments in many communities, is that what we're cleaning is something that we might not necessarily know the contents of. And so one of the issues that the small island states in particular are having, as well as developing countries that have coastlines that are affected by this, is trying to figure out what is in these products so they can then figure out what they need for waste management development and how to prevent toxic exposure, et cetera, for people who are there picking either as volunteers or as waste pickers, which is their job, picking the waste and trying to recycle the plastic or otherwise use the plastic, which has actually caused a really interesting tension with many of the producing countries, because intellectual property laws, for example, protect what may be in a recognized protected compound of plastic or form of plastic, and yet the knowledge of what is in it is necessary to figure out how to clean it. So there are many issues faced by the communities that you talked about in the small island developing context, as well as many others.
That's horrendous to think that a whole bunch of stuff's washing up on your shore, and actually there's no data on how to deal with that well and safely, etc. Before we get on to the Plastics Treaty itself and its background, I was wondering if you could tell us about these are intergovernmental agreements and frameworks that people are trying to put together. But we have the Paris Agreement, which focuses on climate change, and the Global Biodiversity Framework, which surprisingly enough focuses on biodiversity.
Okay.
What's the legal status of these things? What are they?
Of course. I'm really glad that you asked, because it is very confusing. Even to many lawyers, it is very confusing. It is its own realm of kind of language. So the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 as part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So in 1992, there were 3 different instruments adopted. One was the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, affectionately known as UNFCCC, because in international law, we love acronyms. We just do. We just need them. And, you've heard the task force title. This is why we need the acronyms. And we had the Convention on Biodiversity, Biological Diversity, also known as the CBD, and the Convention on Desertification and Drought, which I always mention because it gets very little attention. So that was the third and somewhat less loved triplet, I would say, in terms of attention. What the UNFCCC did was create the ability to then have subsequent agreements, subsequent protocols to reflect the current state of knowledge on plastic, I always say plastics, on climate change. And so this is something that the Paris Agreement is the latest iteration of. We had the Kyoto Protocol, which technically has largely expired, and now we have the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is considered largely binding law, so states have adopted it. There are both binding and voluntary provisions in it, so there are some things that say a state should or may, in which case that is voluntary. There are some things that say a state must or shall, which is very boring legal speak for requiring a state to do so. The Global Biodiversity Framework is slightly different. So that was adopted actually in Montreal in the wake of the pandemic. It was intended to have been adopted in 2020, but then everything that happened with the pandemic pushed it back a bit further. So this didn't happen until 2022. And it is a very serious set of commitments, but it is not legally binding, which can cause a great deal of confusion, especially for lawyers as well. But it also can cause a great deal of confusion in terms of what needs to be put into national planning, what needs to be put into national priorities, and also if there are failings of countries to implement it, what the potential ramifications are, where you would take complaints, et cetera. It still, that said, is considered to be very important in a lot of funding decisions. So, for example, while it is not legally binding, there is actually a significant pot of money that exists in the context of the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, the GEF as we affectionately call it, which is a separate international organization that exists to provide oversight and funding implementation for a number of different treaties. So aspects of UNFCCC in Paris, CBD, the newly created Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions Treaty, the High Seas Treaty, several others, Minamata Convention, for example, all are funded by that. So there is a funding mechanism for GBF, although it is considered non-binding, which I know is very technical and somewhat difficult. But
that complexity, I think, is really important to understand, because I've certainly been trying to head off some non-legal, non-organisational scholars who looked at the Global Biodiversity Framework and say, now all companies have to report, and try to get across which they've got is, and if you don't know, why would you know that these aren't binding on companies?
Exactly.
That even if it was an action about companies, it's binding on states. Should they wish to implement it in law, and then it becomes binding in companies.
Exactly.
So there's all of these steps and stages.
Is there the potential then for things that are not binding now to become binding in the future? Do these agreements, these intergovernmental agreements that have been signed, evolve over time to become different in terms of how they're enacted?
Yeah, they can. They certainly can. And I think it's also important to throw in another aspect that is very different in international law, and that is the idea of custom. So customary international law. And so over time, what we see is that a number of states will agree on something as being either a prohibited practice or an allowed practice, an encouraged practice. And so we might not necessarily have a binding piece of legislation that says this is allowed or it isn't, but it still in practice becomes what we would call custom. And then it can be enforced. There can be cases at the International Court of Justice, et cetera, or domestic courts where that is argued to be custom. So that is certainly one way where we see this happening. So previously, these are rather dramatic examples, but previously, before we had a convention on genocide, before we had a convention on torture or slavery, outlawing it at the international level, these were all considered to be customary international law norms that we did not engage in genocide or torture or slavery after a certain point. And so those then became enshrined in a binding document. It is interesting, I think, to note that especially in the environmental realm and particularly biodiversity, but now also in pollution, we are seeing a shift towards the use of a lot of non-binding, but yet very high-level entities. So the Global Framework on Chemicals, which was adopted in 2023, is actually the outcome of over 16 years of negotiations. And those negotiations were actually fascinating. So the last session went on, there was a pre-session that was over a weekend. So I spent a lovely weekend in Bonn when everyone else was out enjoying the weather and beautiful, summer-like September days. But anyway, the conference center is equally charming and their coffee is fantastic. Just ringing endorsement there. But that took well over a week to get a final negotiation on, and actually went until 10 a.m. the day after it was scheduled to end for something that is not legally binding, but still considered highly persuasive. And then that can also be adopted into national legislation. It can be adopted by countries when they are doing, for example, foreign aid or overseas development assistance. And it also can then be used by companies when we think about things like corporate social responsibility. We think about how they are engaging in their forward movement in that realm. It's something that can be adopted, and companies often are eager to say that they are trying to comply with the GBF or the Global Framework on Chemicals, et cetera, even if they're not binding. So that's another way to kind of sneakily get it in without it being a legal mandatory requirement, at least.
And this brings me back to the podcast we had with Carlos Larrinaga, who talked about how norms come into being. And certainly we have academic ideas about norms and when they become binding, even if they're not mandatory. And sometimes legal norms don't bind. And so there's this real sort of mess in there. I was also very struck, you were talking about 1992 and the triplets of processes that set off. Plastics wasn't in that.
Oh, no.
So how did the idea of a plastics treaty actually come into being?
So, no, plastics certainly were not covered at the time. And what we knew of plastics in 1992 was largely a good thing. And in many ways, they still are, quite necessary at this point because we don't have substitutes. But this is something that came, first of all, out of the discussions around climate and the realization of the toxicity of plastics as well. And as we had emerging science coming out telling us more about what the chemicals are that are in and the polymers that are in plastics and the realization of what this has done. But really, I think the final push came during the pandemic and afterwards, when we started to see much more medical waste, certainly plastic medical waste, coming onto seashores, coming out into the open, and really being considered uncontrolled in many areas. And that was when we finally had this push to do something at an international level. There was an open-ended working group established first that by the UN Environment Program, UNEP, which is the entity that is in charge of kind of trying to administer the treaties that already exist, but then also trying to foster new ones when necessary. And the suggestion of this was that we would need something along the lines of an actual treaty instrument to address plastic pollution. As a result of this, in May, earlier than that, but in 2022, there was a decision made at what we call the continued UN Environment Assembly session, number 5, it was continued due to the pandemic, to authorize the negotiation of a treaty. And the language used is to authorize an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. We affectionately have shortened this to ILBI or ILBI to make it a bit easier to use in written form and in verbal conversation. But that was the mandate. And then to address in the text, the mandate is to address the full life cycle of plastic. So that would include everything from its production to its use, and then ultimately either reuse, recycling, et cetera, or waste management in the final kind of end of life, if you will, phase of plastic. And that is how we got to actually having the negotiation. It's still something that for many people is very novel. It doesn't necessarily get the same attention as climate change at this point. So certainly in the environmental community, we are aware of its process, but outside of it still is quite an education for many people, including for many lawyers who don't really realize that we're having these negotiations or why. So it is a constant good reminder to me to just remember why we're doing it, even as we're sitting there arguing about, commas and semicolons and all of the things that make lawyers very happy to argue about. The rest of the world look at us like, why? Why are you doing this?
So far we've had Jeff, which sounds like a middle-aged man, and we've had Ilby, which sounds like some kind of like child's toy. I've got an Ilby for Christmas.
It's the latest thing. Yes.
An Ilby. Everyone wants an Ilby.
Everyone wants an Ilby. Why not?
So how did you personally become involved then in these negotiations around the Plastics Treaty?
For many years, I have been a member of the World Commission on Environmental Law for the IUCN. And the IUCN, as the name suggests, is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. It is one of the older environmental entities. It was formed right after World War II. And it is itself a very different structure. So we have a headquarters, but we also have a number of commissions. And the commissions are, with the exception of my commission, the World Commission on Environmental Law, largely science-based and science-focused, addressing various forms of environmental issues. So everything from the Committee on Cetaceans to climate, et cetera. The World Commission on Environmental Law has always had the mandate to work in environmental issues, as the name suggests, and has become very involved in negotiations for other treaties, so the Paris Agreement, also the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement, et cetera. And when it became clear that there would be a plastics treaty negotiation, there was a decision made by the chair, Dr. Christina Voigt, who's heavily involved in climate change as well, that we needed to have a task force and we needed to work on this. For reasons beyond my understanding, I was asked to chair this task force. And so I have been chairing it since mid-2022. Again, I do have a number of background I don't want to call them insights, but areas of exposure that would be helpful to this. And from that point onwards, we kind of weren't sure if it would be an academic exercise or what it would be. But I've had the great good fortune to be part of the IUCN negotiating team as an observer, but a UN recognized observer. We do have the ability to participate, to speak, et cetera, in the negotiations. Additionally, because of work done with the government of Norway, so NORAD, which is their foreign development assistance type of activity, an entity, I've had the true privilege, and I continue to have this privilege, to work with several countries in West Africa, so 5 in particular, Sierra Leone, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Cabo Verde, and Sao Tome and Principe, as a legal advisor, as a legal source of information and background throughout the negotiations process, so as a trainer, et cetera. This is included during some intersessional work, so really specialized work between our negotiation sessions, being a representative and an expert for Sao Tome and Principe on legal issues, and then being part of the Guinea-Bissau delegation for the last negotiation session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee process, the INC. Let's throw in an INC to go with an ILBI. It's the latest thing you need to go with your ILBI. To represent Guinea-Bissau on the legal drafting group, which didn't have a chance to do as much as it was intended to do. Hopefully we will at the next session, but is really intended to be a high-level legal entity that will clean the text of proposed treaty language and make sure it actually works in conjunction with international law, et cetera. So I have several hats there. I also do a lot of work with the Quaker UN office. So there is an office of the Quaker faith that is very active in trade issues. And so I was asked early on to work with them just because I also work in international trade as another side topic. So we do a lot of work on the issues of trade and plastics and subsidies, tariffs, et cetera. So I run around all over during the negotiations. This is what I do. It's better than sitting down for hours on end and feeling like you're on like an endless flight, which is easily possible if you're in a negotiation session for too long.
I'm frankly getting fed up of having guests who make me seem lazy.
I agree.
No.
But also, what's really inspiring is how that expertise is buttressing countries that need support, as well as technical expertise about drafting, etc., through to bringing people together to try to hammer out principles and ideas.
Exactly.
It's a really, fascinating world.
It is, and it is such a privilege to be able to work with countries in particular is such a privilege, and to be able to help kind of craft that relationship and that response and bring them into something that is very foreign for many people, and it's such a really complex world. That's something that's irreplaceable to me. Really, it's quite special.
But also for a small country to have the scientific and legal expertise to be able to participate fully and not be disadvantaged by the outcomes is not so straightforward.
No, but it's also, it's what we fight for. It's what we do, why we do it, really, definitely.
Is there the danger of something like the saviour complex, where you've got people from countries like the UK, Canada, the US going in and telling these 5 African countries how it all should work, how it's working, etc.?
Of course. And it really is something to be aware of. I view my role as having expertise and trying to see what the concerns are. What are the concerns? What are the priorities? What are the needs? And then, from understanding that, then I can explain from an international law perspective, this is what might be more advantageous for you. And also, these are the impacts of the various negotiating texts, because what we've had throughout the negotiations is thus far a series of texts coming out of each negotiation round with potential drafts. We had intended for it to be final in December, but that didn't happen. So potential draft text, often quite convoluted, often very long. So we had one coming out of Kenya that was 70 pages, one coming out of the Ottawa round that was 77 pages. So trying to just explain what this means.
You've given us a really clear, good idea of what's going on during these negotiations there. Can you see similarities between what's happening now with plastics and maybe what's gone on in the past with things such as chemicals?
Yes, absolutely, definitely. And because chemicals are an integral part of plastics as well, or the dynamics and the discussions of plastics as well, it's actually interesting to have been part of those negotiations and to see where the arguments that were perhaps not as successful there are now being made in the plastics context, and the same concerns that were voiced there come in, and how some of these things are just a constant thread between countries, also between the corporate actors as well, because we do have, amongst the observers, we have a number of corporate entities. We have lobbying groups for chemicals and petrochemicals, et cetera, and plastics industry. So seeing how those arguments come into is I think very interesting. And then also seeing the cross between the biodiversity negotiations and COPs and the climate change COPs, and not as much desertification and drought. Again, that is the less loved, or I think, it's the Cinderella, if you will, of that particular set of triplets. But even there are some concerns that do come in, and it's just very interesting to see how those arguments come, especially because of the timing. So we've had a negotiation authorization for, I'll explain the sneaky bit about this in a minute, but technically for 5 sessions of negotiations. That was what the UN Environment Assembly authorized. And so we've thus concluded the 5. We finished the last one in December of 2024 without an agreement. So there's a sneaky way to do this, and I'll explain how that goes in a minute. But The timing is quite interesting in that at least 2 of these have been during the end of the year when we also typically have things like the UNFCCC COPs. And this year we actually exceptionally had the UNFCCC COP, the biodiversity COP, and right after the plastics negotiation, the desertification and drought COP. So it's interesting to see how the momentum from that comes into negotiations and brings issues that might not necessarily have been as big or as important or divisive before, but as a residual from the other negotiations brings them in. Just to explain to our listeners how we can go on when we've only had an authorization for 5 sessions. There is a very different aspect of closing a meeting and saying we are gaveling the meeting closed, which means the meeting is done, it's finished, it's over, which was the procedure used for the 1st through 4th sessions of the negotiations. The 5th session did not end with a gavel close. It ended with an adjournment. And so as long as we are able to keep adjourning, we're able to continue on theoretically the 5th session. So as of the time of recording, at least, we do not yet know the location and the date, but we do know that it will be what we call a 5.2. INC 5.2. Certainly, many people have asked me, can it go beyond a 5.2? And theoretically, yes, it could just be adjourned into a multiple number of meetings. We're going to hope that doesn't happen. But that is how we continue with the process, and that's how we're able to continue the negotiation, although technically, we didn't actually have an agreement after the 5th session. Leave it to lawyers to find a way to do this.
Not wishing to, play into stereotypes of giving lawyers bad names, etc., but they just keep adjourning to earn more money, don't they? It's like, oh, get another session, get a few more hours, billable hours down here, that's fine.
And, and go more fun places. I mean, it's...
But presumably only see the inside of a conference hall,
yes.
Possibly a hotel if you get a chance to sleep and the airport. It's not the best holiday plan.
Not really, no. I mean, if you enjoy a lovely conference center and a lot of concrete, it's the place for you. It is, definitely.
You're assuming that all of these lawyers aren't, just on the beach all the time. Alex has joked about that, but in that joke there was a hidden
cynical.
Truth.
It's where I wanted to be as I was sitting there in absolutely stunning Busan, South Korea, looking at. I could see the ocean every morning when I woke up, and then I had to leave my hotel and go to the conference center.
All I know about Busan in South Korea is that there was a train that went there that was full of zombies.
I was actually on that train. It was not full of zombies when I was on it, but I was looking for them. It just looked, I was the zombie because I was sleep deprived. Anyway.
What happened?
It was a film, Jan.
Oh,
it was a
okay.
film. I think the film is actually called Train to Busan.
It is called, I know. And I was eagerly looking, but really with the lack of sleep from the fight, I was probably the only zombie there.
Essentially, if you want to escape zombie apocalypse, go to Busan.
Right.
But you have to get there first and not be eaten by zombies.
But once you're there, you're good.
Yeah.
It's fine.
In theory. Who knows what happens after that? I've not seen if there was a sequel.
Well, zombies. Who knew we were going to get to zombies? I'm quite interested in terms of quite often when people, because I'm not of this world, but people know I might know something about it. People go, oh, it takes for ages. What are they doing? It takes forever. Mm-hmm. You go, years and years and years. And yet your description of the plastic one, this is a fast process compared to many of the others. So some treaties take a long time, others presumably are shorter. What makes that distinction?
There are several things. And having a short, there's an argument about having a short window and whether that actually is a good thing or whether it gets us to something like a framework but then doesn't allow us to actually have a really detailed treaty. So one thing is the actual mandate for the negotiation process itself. We rather exceptionally had the mandate for the plastics treaty from the UN Environment Assembly that this should have been done by the end of last year. So it specifically had the ambition of being finished by the end of 2024. That is quite rare. And I think it actually is a response to things like the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction example where you had it drag on for over 20 years and the global framework on chemicals. What happens often is that politics, perhaps not surprisingly, comes in, the geopolitical situation comes in and really does kind of change national priorities. And when those national priorities change, then national negotiation position changes. And we start to see a lack of coherence on issues that might have been very clearly agreed on when we came into the negotiations. And that then continues the process on. We will all hope, including myself, because I as fun as it is, I don't want to spend 20 years negotiating this, that we are a bit more brief in this negotiation process than the BB&J. But it also, I think, depends on the complexity of the topic. And BB&J was regarded by many as being rather esoteric in the sense that it relates to, as the name suggests, biodiversity that is outside of a national jurisdiction. So it's often hard to make domestic audiences understand why we need to spend time and money and energy on this. Plastics is extremely complex. And I think that as a topic, and I think that when the initial decision was made to have a treaty, none of us really fully understood the complexity and the levels that would go into it, because it's not just an environmental treaty. It will be a human rights treaty. It will be a trade treaty. It will be a health treaty. It will have all of these different aspects. And that realization is when you start to then expand exactly. Jan is sitting here making an expanding motion, and it is indeed the case. And that's where we have this concept of, it needs to be longer. The process needs to be a bit longer to really hammer out some of these details. So that's why it does tend to take as long as it does.
It sounds impossible to say precisely what are going to be the key elements of this treaty because it's still being hammered out. What would you hope are going to be the major parts of it?
So I would hope that there is a significant argument about this. I would hope that this includes something on primary plastic polymers, plastic production, chemicals of concern, plastic product design. These are all quite contentious, but they are also quite critical for us to actually be able to have a treaty that is really meaningful and that can evolve in a very substantial way over time. I think it will be critical for us to use things like annexes so that we can update it and not have something that becomes outdated as soon as it is adopted because science changes, the technical composition of plastics changes, et cetera. I also think it's critical that we have something that allows us to have a strong COP system, Conference of the Parties system, and that has a national reporting requirement that can be used to support national legislation. Because there's a question always of if we make it a binding requirement for national reporting, it costs more and it potentially can be used as a method of complaint, et cetera, if there is not a significant level of compliance. However, if we don't have that, then it is very easy for the politics of plastics in particular to overwhelm countries that need legislation. And this is across the spectrum of development, so developed countries as well as developing countries, and have it become a sidetrack and have it become something more like a nationally determined contribution in the climate change context where the countries decide what goes in, and it's very difficult to police. And so we've spent years potentially, technically over 2 years, negotiating something that then is very difficult to put into place in a meaningful way. So that's why I think we really need that strong obligation. That would be my dream. That would be my hope. A set of definitions would be absolutely lovely. I should have done this before Christmas, so I could ask Father Christmas for definitions because we don't, as of yet, strangely, we don't actually have a definition of plastic to be used in the treaty as of yet. And so that does make it a bit more difficult.
I know that that's something that actually the Plastic Packaging People's Lives Project people looked at, the fact that you had to define what a plastic was and how complicated it is just to define what a plastic is and how different people mentally have a different idea and how there's a chemical definition, but there's also a more practical definition and a more esoteric definition. There's so many definitions of plastic.
And I think one of the things that I always find wondrous, and one of the reasons I really like working at a university, but also like working with governments and companies as well, is that everything that we take for granted that's around us, that's sitting on this table, we think, oh, there's a bit of plastic. Actually, as soon as you, even a cursory look, actually it's more complicated than that. And then more complicated, and then more complicated. And actually our modern world just works around us, but the amount of work that goes into it working around us is phenomenal.
Oh, it is. No, it really is. And I think we just become accustomed to it. We see it every day.
Yeah. And I think we'd go crazy if we paid attention to it all.
Oh, we would.
But somewhere, some people, and I'm really pleased it's you and some of your colleagues, have to pay attention to it for it to work well.
No, we do. And it does certainly change the way you view your everyday life. And I'm sure that I drive many people a bit up the wall with, looking at things going, don't use that, or don't use it, make sure that goes in the right bin. And, or having a fit about even if you put it in the right bin, it doesn't really go where it should go, and all of these things. But absolutely, it changes the way you think about things.
I don't think there's a single guest we've had on this podcast who probably doesn't drive friends, family up the wall about their specific topic of interest, because that's what expert researchers and academics are for driving everyone else around them insane.
Well, we make everyone else around us also experts in their own way. It's what we do.
You've sounded quite optimistic at times. I want to know what's making you most optimistic, and when do you think we can finally celebrate this treaty?
When do I hope we can? Realistically, I think by the end of this year, so by the end of 2025 or into 2026, I think we will celebrate the end of the negotiation process. Just to point out that the end of the negotiation process isn't really the end, in that being a good lawyer and just bringing in all the technicalities. If we have an agreement at 5.2 or whenever we may have the agreement, we then have to have about a 6-month wait for what we call it it sounds like something out of a Star Trek movie, the DipCon, which is to say the diplomatic conference. It sounds like it should have its own Death Star. But anyway, the diplomatic conference. And the diplomatic conference is where very high-level people come. So presidents, prime ministers, or high-level ministers come, and they officially sign for their countries saying, we would like to be part of this. We endorse this. That is not, however, the end. So the end is when everyone goes home and they ratify it in their national procedures, which can take a great deal of time. And then whatever the amount of countries that we agree on in the treaty text, typically it's 50, but we will see, that it's required to have a ratification process go into place and have everything become effective, then occurs. So it will take a bit of time. But my hope is that we can at least come back and celebrate the fact that we have a treaty text by the end of this year or into next year. And I think I'm optimistic because you have to be. If you're not optimistic that you can do something that at least will be valuable in some way, then it's probably the wrong space for you to be in, because you have to have hope. And no matter what, no matter what it is, if it's a framework text, if it's something that has to be updated in various annexes, et cetera, having a text, having an agreement on plastics, realizing that from the international perspective, we need to regulate plastics is, I think, a win in and of itself. It's just a question of how much of a win do we get, and how much do we celebrate.
And before this episode, I would have thought, by the end of this year seems like a long time away. But then hearing talk of 60 years to get other things sorted, seems like that's a brilliant win.
That does sound like a win. And I think you're right. A lack of optimism means you'd never get in the room and get going. But at the same time, it's non-trivial work.
Thank you. It's always good to hear that, and it's, everyone always hears the exotic destinations and thinks, oh, it's great, it's lovely, you must be having a wonderful time.
It's hard work.
It's also hard when you drive by the exotic destinations and go, oh, look,
Here's what you could have won.
Exactly. You could have won this, but instead you won the same grey conference room in another country.
Alex, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much.
I can safely say, Jan, that Alex must be one of the most impressive guests we've had on this show. The repertoire of things that she is involved with and her expertise is just amazing.
It is, and I presume she doesn't need to sleep, because what she's been describing in terms of these, all-night sessions about flying to quite far-flung places, but then working really hard and then flying home is, just astonishing. And as you say, really, really impressive among a number of guests, none of whom are unimpressive. So she was certainly, it was super to get to chat to her.
And just hearing about all the complications and the frustrations, but also the optimism that comes from these negotiations and discussions that are taking place between nations, between organisations, between people with so much difference in terms of mindset, geography, culture. Wow.
I sometimes think the more you do, the more pragmatically optimistic you are. And so I suppose if you are only, sitting on the edges of these things and worrying, you might not be as optimistic as being in the midst of it. I saw a lot of hidden connections to the oceans, and you know how much I like ocean thinking.
Yes. I can see that in a future conversation we're going to be having in a few weeks' time with John Verdin about oceans, and that there's going to be some similar areas surely going to come up about areas that are beyond national control and all of the laws that apply there.
Yeah. Well, certainly the BBNJ, so that's the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, that was really important for some of the work that we've done with the Seafood Businesses for Ocean Stewardship Group in terms of they're accessing biodiversity outside of national jurisdictions. And so I knew about that. What I hadn't thought through so much is plastic landing on beaches and affecting people's health. That was quite an arresting realisation to come to.
Yeah, and the fact that the same people who are affected by rising tides are affected by plastics washing up, and therefore they've come together as a group at one COP regarding climate. The same nations are sticking together when it comes to plastics because they've got the same issue again is uniting them.
And I hadn't heard about it, so it's very good to hear about it, the Global Framework on Chemicals. So I'm going to go and have a wee hunt around the university and see if we can find somebody for a future podcast. It might have to be Series 3 because Series 2 is sort of, pretty well planned now. But we have people who specialise in chemicals. So it'd be really nice to hear from them about how it affects, chemists and what they do.
And being able to compare the chemicals convention with what's going on with plastics at the minute and how you can be so optimistic about a plastics treaty being done in the space of 5 or 6 years since it was first conceived compared to what happened with chemicals and 60 years of negotiation and talk and back and forth. And it's just crazy that it could take that long. And also then ridiculously optimistic that it could only take 5 or 6 years for plastics.
But I do sometimes think some of the ones that take the longest, and climate would be a good example of that, is because we've built a high carbon industry. A whole basis of our economic organisation is around high carbon. So actually to negotiate a difference is really quite difficult. Whereas maybe with plastics, the realisation has come together that this is an endemic harm that we want to sort out. So it might be much more straightforward. And we have built our lives around plastics, but not in the same way as the whole of the world economy is built around a high carbon model. So sometimes the physical nature of the feature that the treaties are being made about will undoubtedly affect the ability of nations to come together and do something about it.
And a lot is obviously going to depend upon the politics of certain major nations in the world. I don't think we need to mention names, but there are certain nations that are going to have specific attitudes towards what should happen with plastics based upon who is politically in charge at the time. And there's going to be more elections this year in certain big economies as well that will affect that.
I think Alex must have a high level of patience, because if everything was nailed down and there's a new government and everything then is sort of unnailed and has to be redone, it would cause you to tear your hair out, I'm sure. But it's the reality of the world. That's the way the world does and has to work.
And as a bonus, Alex has obviously got to know the corridors of Bonn's conference centres ridiculously well over the years. And, I've been past Bonn several times on the train. It doesn't look like the most exotic place to visit, I have to say. But Alex obviously loves it.
Well, she loves the view from her conference hotels.
And if nothing else, that's what she's got. Well, next time, Jan, we're not going to be in Bonn, but we are going to be in foreign climes because we're going to be speaking to 2 guests from Switzerland.
That's very good. And so these guests are people that we've got to know who have a really interesting book that they're going to talk us through. So might you say more about them?
Yeah, we're going to be speaking to Julia Binder and Knut Harnes, who are from IMD Business School in Lausanne, all about their book, Leading the Sustainable Business Transformation, and their experience working around sustainability in business. And believe me, they've got a lot of experience.
That sounds brilliant.
Until then, thank you very much for listening. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jane Bevington.